You ever stare at China and wonder, why the hell won't they just reform? Why China resists every Western criticism like a brick wall? Why Chinese citizens defend a dictatorship like it's their grandma? Well, I've got news for you. China doesn't want to become like the West. It doesn't even understand the West. In fact, China sees the West as weak, decadent, and doomed. China is not playing the same game. It is flipping the board and writing its own rules. And that is exactly why it is spiraling toward collapse. Let me take you on a ride in this video through war, famine, Confucius, Karl Marx, Mao, and a century of trauma to show you why China's system didn't fail by accident. It was built to break. Let's start with the West, because that is where every confused China apologist misses the point. In Western thought, a person is an individual. You're born with inalienable rights, freedom of speech, religion, property, and the government exists only to protect those rights. This wasn't random. It came from centuries of thought. Thomas Hobbes said that people surrender a bit of freedom to form governments that protect them from chaos. John Locke took it further, arguing that if a government violates people's rights, the people have the right to overthrow it. Tocqueville warned that democracy is fragile but essential. And in America, the founders encoded all this in the Constitution, backed by the Bill of Rights. No king, no party, no absolute power. That is the Western default. People over power. Now, let's pivot to China. China doesn't come from John Locke. It comes from Confucius. And Confucius wasn't about rights. He was all about roles, right? About knowing your place in a hierarchy and not rocking the boat. But here's the part they usually don't teach you in schools. Confucius didn't win in China by default. He won by imperial design. Look, ancient China wasn't short on ideas. The Warring States period from 475 to 221 BC was like China's version of the Enlightenment period on steroids. You had Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, preaching harmony with nature and non-action, Wu Wei, essentially anti-authoritarian hippie with divine wisdom. Mo Tzu, the utilitarian pacifist who believed in universal love, meritocracy, and anti-aggression. Legalists like Han Feizi, who thought people were naturally selfish and needed iron fist laws. Mengzi, a Confucian reformer who softened Confucius' teachings, argued that humans were naturally good and that rulers needed the people's moral approval. So why did Confucius, arguably the most conservative of them all, become the cornerstone of Chinese thought? Simple. He was the perfect match for imperial control. By the time Han Dynasty rolled around, China had just unified after centuries of chaos, and the emperor needed a glue, something to justify centralized rule without making it look like brute force. So enter Confucius. He taught royalty, ritual, obedience, and social order. He said that harmony comes when people follow their role. Ruler to subject, father to son, husband to wife. So the Han emperors stamped him into the bureaucratic DNA of the Chinese state. They burned Taoist texts, sidelined legalists, and installed Confucianism as the official ideology of the civil service exam system, which lasted for the next 2,000 years. Let that sink in. For 2 millennia, if you wanted power, prestige, or a place in a ruling class in China, you had to memorize the wise words of Confucius and perform Confucian virtue like a trained actor. It wasn't just philosophy anymore. It became a moral surveillance system built to produce obedient administrators who never questioned the emperor and saw rebellion as immorality, not justice. Fast forward to today, and you will still hear this line in China: without order, there's no harmony, right? That's not Karl Marx, that's Confucius, reanimated for the 21st century surveillance state. The CCP resurrects Confucian language all the time: harmony, 和谐, benevolent governance, 仁政. But it's all smoke and mirrors. They want the submission Confucius taught, but not the moral responsibility Confucius demanded from rulers. In other words, the party loves Confucius as long as it keeps people quiet and royal. So no, China isn't a civilization of natural-born authoritarians. It had other options. It had thinkers who valued human dignity, love, and even democracy in primitive form. But the system chose Confucius, not because he was right, but because he was the most useful. And that is the legacy China is still trapped in today. A 2,000-year-old moral operating system, hijacked by a modern digital dictatorship. Now, let's jump into China's historical meat grinder. For 2,000 years, emperors ruled by the mandate of heaven. But in 1911, the Qing Dynasty collapsed, and everything just fell apart. Foreign powers carved China up, the Japanese invaded, warlords ruled provinces like mafia bosses, hyperinflation soared, 6 million yuan to $1 by the 1940s. People starved, bled, and died by the millions. In that chaos, China tried everything. Republic under Sun Yat-sen, Sun Zhongshan hijacked. Nationalist government, Kuomintang, corrupt and weak. By 1949, the Communist Party under Mao won the Civil War, and the Chinese people, exhausted by anarchy, accepted control in exchange for survival, and Mao's dictatorship as national salvation. Mao wasn't interested in democracy. He wrote a piece titled "On the People's Democratic Dictatorship." Sounds like an oxymoron, right? But in Mao's eyes, dictatorship was necessary to crush class enemies, purge foreign influence, and resurrect China's glory. And when Mao took over, he didn't just revive China's imperial-style control. He supercharged it with Soviet tools: one-party rule, centralized command, mass surveillance, ideological purges. The old emperor ruled by bloodline. The new emperor ruled by class struggle. Same control, just updated with Marxist packaging. And just like that, dissent became treason. Democracy became poison. The state swallowed the citizen. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable, especially for Westerners who ask, why don't the Chinese people rise up? I used to get this question all the time when I was in college. How do you put up with the dictatorship. Why don't you guys fight back? Don't you guys want freedom? I get it. I really do. But the answer is not that simple. You have to understand the Chinese psyche. It is shaped by Confucian duty, not liberal rights. It is traumatized by foreign invasion and national collapse. It's been taught that only the CCP saved China from a century of humiliation. And after decades of constant state propaganda, many Chinese genuinely believe the West wants to destabilize China. Democracy is chaos. The party is their only guardian. It's not just blind royalty, it's also trauma induced pragmatism. China doesn't just remember its past, it relieves it every day. The century of humiliation from 1839 to 1949 is tattooed into every Chinese textbook and news broadcast. Opium wars, treaty ports, Japanese massacres, Western meddling. The narrative goes, the West humiliated us. The CCP saved us. So now the West must shut up. That's why criticism hits so hard. When the US talks about human rights, China hears colonial condescension. When Europe calls out surveillance or censorship, Beijing cries hypocrisy and interference. It's not about facts, it's about face. The CCP would rather collapse with ego than reform with humility. Now, someone always chimes in with, but wait, Taiwan is Chinese and it's democratic. And they're right. Taiwan is living proof that Confucius culture and a liberal democracy aren't mutually exclusive. You could have Chinese traditions and human rights. But here's the difference. Taiwan didn't go through the same political meat grinder as the mainland. Taiwan never had Mao. It never suffered under a cult of personality that turned ideology into religion and murdered millions in the name of socialist utopia. It never had the Cultural Revolution. No red guards smashing temples. No professors paraded through the streets. No decade-long national psychosis where children turned on parents and logic was replaced with royalty. It never buried its past in silence. Taiwan eventually faced its authoritarian era under the KMT. It underwent transitional justice. It apologized to the families of the White Terror. It aired its historical dirty laundry and just moved forward. Mainland China, still pretending the Great Leap Forward never happened. Still denying Tiananmen massacre even exists. Still punishing anyone who questions the party's fairy tale version of history. Culturally, Taiwan is just as Confucian as the mainland. It teaches respect for elders. It values education. Families are tight-knit. Social order matters. But what Taiwan didn't do is weaponize Confucianism as an excuse to suppress democracy. Instead, it adopted it, evolving tradition to feed a modern society. You can criticize the president in Taipei and not disappear. You can vote, protest, even mock the government, all while still honoring your ancestors and attending traditional festivals. That's the big lie the CCP wants to sell. Oh, democracy is Western. It doesn't fit Chinese culture. Total nonsense. Taiwan brewed that myth to pieces. And that is why Beijing hates it so much. Not because of independence, not because of foreign interference, but because Taiwan exists as a mirror. And that mirror shows the CCP what China could have been if it hasn't sold its soul to dictatorship. Let's be honest, Taiwan and the mainland are locked in a quiet war, not only over territory, but also over legitimacy. The CCP claims to represent all Chinese people, but Taiwan is Chinese too, and it holds free elections, has an independent judiciary, and ranks above many Western countries in civil liberties. So, what does that say about Beijing's whole narrative? It says you don't need authoritarianism to be stable and prosperous. You don't need censorship to have a thriving society. You don't need a party state to preserve culture. Taiwan shatters the illusion the CCP has built for decades. And that is why mainland regime wants to absorb it, not for national pride, but for its own political survival. So here's the bottom line. China is the way it is because of Confucian thought that teaches obedience, century-long trauma that demands strength, Soviet influence that cemented dictatorship, and a party that weaponizes history to stay in power. But this system is rigid, resentful, and terrified of truth, and cannot adapt. It cannot course correct. It cannot admit failure without unraveling. That is why collapse isn't just likely, it is inevitable. Because China didn't reject the West to find its own special path. It rejected the West to cling to control. And now it is trapped in a time bomb of its own making.